Is it on now?
Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Pierce. I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961, and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com. Start with some of the amazing authors we have coming up this summer, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of tonight's featured book available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things. Now I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Kalpana, Raina, and Shubha Sunder here to discuss and celebrate the release of Kalpana's new translation of For Now It Is Night by Hare Krishna Kaul, a collection of lively short stories that provide an irreverent examination of exile drawn from the ever-observant pen of one of Kashmir's most celebrated writers. Kalpana Raina, born in Kashmir, is a senior executive, board director, and advisor in both corporate and not-for-profit sectors. Her writing has been published in LitHub and Words Without Borders, and she lives in New York. And tonight's moderator, Shubha Sunder's short story collection, Boomtown Girl, won the 2021 St. Lawrence Book Award. Her debut novel, Optional Practical Training, will be published in 2025 by Grey Wolf Press. Her stories and essays have appeared in places like Catapult, The Common, New Letters, Crazy Horse, and Narrative Magazine, and received notable mentions in Best American Short Stories. Her fiction has been shortlisted for the Flannery O'Connor Short Story Award, the Hudson Prize, and the New American Press Fiction Press. She is a 2020 recipient of the City of Boston Award, Fellowship Award, and a 2016 recipient of the Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellowship. We're very lucky to have her here tonight. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation. Now, Kalpana and Shubha.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Thanks, Pierce, for having us and everyone at Brookline Booksmith. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Kalpana. As I was walking over, my umbrella malfunctioned, and I was thinking of the character from the story A Late Winter, and his umbrella shuts like a cage over his head. I was like, oh, it feels familiar. But thank you for giving a home in English to this short story collection. Before we talk about the stories themselves, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship to Hare Krishna Kaul, the late Hare Krishna Kaul, who is your uncle, and your relationship to Kashmir and the Kashmiri language, and what prompted you to translate this book.
Thank you, Shubha, for agreeing to do this. It's a great honor to be here with you. As Pierce pointed out, you're quite a rising star on the literary scene in Boston, so I'm really thrilled. And thank you, Brookline Books, for doing this. My relationship to Kashmir is not particularly straightforward, but it's an important one. I was born in Kashmir, and I lived there for about 6 years, and then my parents left to go to England. And when they came back to India 4 or 5 years later, they did not move back to Kashmir. They lived in another place, and so my visits to Kashmir went from being permanently living there to summer trips to see my grandparents. And my grandparents lived with my uncle. It was a joint family, and they lived with my uncle's family. So every summer I had pretty much an extended experience to that family and obviously to my uncle. But I related to him and to his work really as my uncle, not really capable of reading his stories at that point, primarily because I was too young, primarily because he was still and wasn't quite, hadn't quite gained the popularity that he gained later. He was still writing through the early stages. And also because people of his generation in the literary landscape of Kashmir actually wrote in Nastaliq script, which is the Perso-Arabic script. And I was never taught that script. And many people in my generation were not taught that script. Excuse me. So all of that made that pretty hard for me to really appreciate his writings growing up. I left India when I was 20 to go to university abroad, and did not really go back to Kashmir until last summer, which was 48 years later. I know I'm dating myself here, but in that intervening period, and as I kept going back to visit my parents, at one of those times I encouraged my father to read the stories to me, some of which I'd heard in my childhood, but I encouraged him to just read half a dozen, 8 or 10 stories to me. And my graduate degrees being in literature, I had the ability to recognize a good story when I saw one. And the more I heard, the more I realized that these were really little gems of literature and needed, in my mind, I thought they needed a wider audience and to be disseminated. But that idea stayed with me for many, many years without my actually acting on it, because obviously Kashmir was already in turmoil at that point. My uncle had left, as had the other Kashmiri Hindus. And the inability to read the script remained a huge stumbling block. It wasn't much later that when I started working with some translators in Bangalore, actually, a residency Sangam House in Bangalore, that I realized, and I was encouraged by the people at Sangam House to think about actively translating. And I thought initially, okay, I will go get some collaborators, co-translators to work with me. And then my co-translators, and we can go into that a little bit later, recorded the stories that we had picked, that others had helped us pick, because there's 4 collections of stories and there's 18 stories in this collection. And as they recorded the stories and I started listening to them, and with the encouragement of my friends in Bangalore, I actually thought this would be something I could attempt. And we started very early in Bangalore, and we thought we were going to do a standard translation. There were 4 of us for a variety of reasons. And we divided the stories amongst ourselves, thinking we'd each work on a group of stories. And they went back to Kashmir and to Bangalore. One of them lived in Bangalore. And the August 5th, 2019, the Indian government abrogated a very important article of the Indian Constitution that used to give Kashmir its special autonomous status. And obviously that was a political upheaval for the people in Kashmir, but more so, the internet was shut down, so it cut off my connection with my co-translators, with my collaborators. And so for about 5 or 6 months, I don't know what they were doing, but I was working in a vacuum. And eventually, when we got back together in Bangalore, so Bangalore is very important to this story. Shubha is from Bangalore, which is why I'm mentioning this. And we got together, it was March 2020. And we again started to work on this, and we dispersed, and COVID happened. And we were again left to our own devices to work on these stories. But it was during COVID that we realized we'd have the internet, so we could work on Zoom. For the next 2 years, we worked. I was back in New York, they were in various places, and we worked on Zoom for 2 years. And it was through that process of both reading and hearing the stories. Someone said to me, well, was this translation by consensus? And I said, no, it wasn't translation by consensus. It was 4 people coming together who were completely enthralled by these stories and putting out their versions and willing to listen to disagreements or contradictions. And it all came about that we came up with these 18 stories. And when the publishers, the book was published in India in October of last year. So HarperCollins publisher in India and Archipelago here in New York, both editors asked us, how do you want to represent the translators? And we said, we can't really name one translator to one story anymore. There's been so much give and take, and I can talk a little bit about that. So it was published collectively under our 4 names. And so I don't know if that answered your question completely, but my relationship to Kashmir and Kashmir has intensified or deepened as a process of this translation.
What was it like for you to go back after 48 years?
It was very emotional, much more emotional than I thought. I was one of the lucky ones that the family home was still intact. And that was going to, I was really going to, it was sort of like a pilgrimage I needed to do before the book came out. I wanted to go and see where it had all started. And I was lucky to have that. A lot of people in my situation didn't have that, because after the Hindus left, the homes were burnt or looted or destroyed or appropriated by other people. So finding my way back to that home was very, very interesting, but seeing along the way the stamp of history of how one community, or its presence of one community that had lived, maybe not harmoniously, that would be an exaggeration, but lived comfortably with the other community, had now been completely obliterated from the physical landscape of the city, because their houses were in complete disrepair. But when I came to this house, the house that my uncle lived in, miraculously, it was completely intact. It had survived because the people who bought it were not living in it. They used it as a storage house. So the actual structure, I'm sorry, would you mind if I just turn my chair a little bit to be able to face the audience better? I feel like I'm twisting my neck here. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay, now adjusting the mic. Okay, is that better? Sorry. It was just amazing to see this structure totally intact. Of course, it was in disrepair. It hadn't been painted. The shutters were blown off of the windows, but the structure was there exactly as I remembered it. And the new family, I call them the new family. They have owned that house for 20 years, but in my head, they were still the new family. Were very gracious and allowed me to walk through, and took me around, and they were extremely gracious and hospitable. And I realized as they walked me through the rooms brought back a lot of memories, again, because they were completely intact. I mean, the objects, the possessions were not there, but the structures were there. And by virtue of the fact, interestingly, that no one had actually lived in this house, I kind of felt that my family's history had not been written over, if you like. It hadn't been erased. I could still remember what happened in each window nook, what it was like to look out of a particular window, what happened in the corridors. And if anyone's interested, that article appeared in Words Without Borders about a month ago with pictures of the house and the surroundings. So it brought back a lot of memories, but as I left Kashmir, as I left Srinagar, I also realized that it was a city of my past. It was not a city where I saw a future for myself. So in that sense, I was able to put it behind me, but some of those experiences will always stay. I had a wonderful time. People were very gracious and very hospitable and very excited by the fact that I had come to look for my roots, if you like, and helped me all along the way.
It seems like the trip home kind of mirrored, in a way, the translation process of you finding your way back to the language to give these stories life in English. So the stories are not all set in Kashmir, but they all have Kashmiri characters, many of whom have, like your uncle, been forced to leave and make lives for themselves elsewhere, often quite, unwillingly. Can you tell us a bit more about, the context? Why did people have to leave? Why did your uncle have to leave? And what does it mean for you to be a Kashmiri translator at this moment in history? Kashmir has always occupied like a complicated place, I think, in Indian history. And having grown up in Bangalore, as I was telling Kalpana earlier, one barometer of how bad the political situation was in Kashmir was the availability of fruit from Kashmir in the local markets. And growing up, I remember these like little apples that were amazing. It was just you could get maybe 3 bites out of them, but they were amazing bites. And there were years when we had them and years when we didn't. Anyway, yeah. Give us tell us a little bit more about both your uncle's circumstances of having to leave and which is what happens to the characters in the stories, to many of them.
Sure. Let me start by saying I'm not going to go too deep into the political history of Kashmir because
we'll be here a long time.
We'll be here a long time, and like every contentious event in history, there are multiple opinions, and I don't think I'm particularly qualified to speak about it, not having lived in Kashmir for some of the most tumultuous period of its recent history. But the events that led to the exodus or exile, as some people call it, of the Hindus, happened in the winter of 1989-1990. There's always been very active, well, not always very active, but a struggle for Kashmiri independence that had always been simmering under the surface for a variety of reasons, became very active that winter, and a lot of people felt threatened and were threatened physically, my uncle being one of them. And we're literally told to leave the city or else they would be killed. And my uncle did leave overnight, bundled himself and his wife and my grandfather, who was still alive, into a car and left. Obviously that was very traumatic, but for a writer, as you can imagine, not only overnight did he lose his home, his homeland, if you like, his livelihood. He taught in a local college, so that was gone. But he also lost his manuscripts. He did not take his manuscripts with him. And a lot of these, half the collection of the 4 volumes had been published by then, but he'd also written a lot of plays for radio and television, and all of that stayed behind. And he also lost the audience for his writings because outside of Kashmir, there is no, it's such a small, marginalized part of India, and the language is marginalized. So once you leave Kashmir, no one speaks Kashmiri, and no one would be reading Kashmiri. So this all happened overnight. So for an author, that was pretty traumatic. But going back to the theme of journeys, which is very prominent in this book, I see this all kind of tied together. In the Kashmiri imagination, geography is very simple. There's Kashmir, which is here and now, and then there's everything that's outside of Kashmir is there. It doesn't matter where it is, but it's there. And I see you shaking your head, so you're obviously very familiar with this. And it could be 10 miles away, it could be across the mountains, it could be across the oceans, but it's there. And there's a lot of journeys, even in these stories and in Kashmiri lives, because of the harsh winters. There are a lot of journeys between Kashmir and warmer climates. But the journeys always, as you mentioned in one of the stories, the late winter, always explore a return back to Kashmir. Until they don't, until the moment of exile, when they know there's no longer a here to go back to. And the there that was always out there becomes your here and now, and that's what you have to deal with. So it gets complicated, and this concept of journeys back and forth is something that he explores a lot. And it's also explored in one of my favorite stories in this collection, which is the last story, which actually talks about the moment of exile, when that final journey is made, and there's that knowledge that you won't be going back. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to read from that selection right now.
It's a great moment to read from that story.
The story is called To Rage or to Endure, and it's the last story in the Archipelago selection. I'll read the first paragraph of the story just to set up the paragraphs where the exile, the actual moment of exile happens. I was accustomed to soft, white, cottony snow. In the late autumn months, Dad, my grandmother, would start worrying that Shinabud, Old Man Snow, would show up any day. And so she would dry garlands of sliced gourd and aubergine in the sun in advance of his arrival. I didn't know if she intended to adorn the old man with these garlands or huddle in a corner and satisfy her own appetite. I could never figure out whether she loved the snow or dreaded it. Dad would complain, and perhaps rightly so, that snow is cold. As for me, the very sight of it gave me the feeling of warmth that comes from quilts filled with freshly carded cotton. My brother moved out of our house soon after he got married. My sister-in-law would not make garlands of gourd and aubergine to welcome Shinabud or to guard herself against him. She would call the carder at the end of the lane over and get him to tease out cotton from her worn-out quilts before filling them again. Then she would get the tailor's apprentice from across the road to make snow-white covers for these quilts. My sister-in-law's intelligence and the skills of the carder and the tailor made me think that this is how one should prepare to welcome the snow. Dad's lack of preparedness and my own naivete made me feel sorry for myself. But when the snow fell heavily, I rejoiced at the thought that there was a carder up in the sky, far more skilled than the one at the end of the lane, who carded tons of cotton for my quilts and mattresses. No human craftsman could match that master craftsman who cut bales of snow-white cloth to make pristine covers for these quilts. So this is the narrator talking about his reaction to snow, and then the story shifts and changes. That year too, that year being the winter of 1989-1990, that year too, Dad made garlands of dried gourd and aubergine to welcome Shinabud, or to guard herself against him. That year too, it snowed heavily. The snow danced as it fell from the sky, but as soon as it touched the ground, it went into a frenzy. Or perhaps a gust of wind came in from somewhere and struck the soft flakes descending from the sky, turning them into ice, freezing them just as they hit the ground. The soft heaps of cotton turned to frost, and the bales of white cloth turned into crystals. Neither Dad nor I was accustomed to this. An icy wind blew that pierced the flesh and bones and froze the warm blood that ran through people's veins before they even realized what had hit them. They could have grasped it only if they had been used to it. When I saw this cruel face of Shinabud and was confronted by the icy winds, I let out a scream, and Dad screamed even louder. But none of our neighbors heard us. Perhaps even our screams froze before they could reach their ears. Dad held me tight and started howling. I lifted her on my back and turned towards the door. Dad glanced around the house, gathering the images of the garlands of gourd and aubergine hanging in the attic, the pots and pans lying about in the rooms and corridors, and bundled them away in her heart. Perhaps my heart was already frozen. The plates covered in mold, the earthenware with iced-on collard greens, the frozen pitcher, the horoscope trapped in unfavorable planetary combinations, the almanac stamped with ominous dates. I kicked it all away to clear a path in front of us. As soon as I stepped out of the door with Dev, I slipped. We kept rolling down the icy slopes until we reached a place we did not recognize. The cotton soft snow had held my feet to its chest and caressed them gently, but this frozen snow could not bear our weight even for a second. It hurled us to the ground and we skidded on its slippery surface, tumbling down countless slopes, through gorges and crevices, until we reached a place where the sky above was on fire and the sand below blazed like an oven. "Is there anyone around?" Dad yelled again. But just like before, no one came to help us. She sighed. I tried to tell her, who will come to help us here? In this endless desert, we are like 2 grains of sand, almost non-existent. In the scope of this universe, you and I are just 2 dots, 2 points.
That was beautiful.
I'll stop there, but I'll go back to reading the end of that story, because what this story, I've read a lot of literature of exile, whether it's the Palestinian diaspora, the Syrian diaspora, the countless diasporas around the world, given the situation of the globe that we inhabit. And to me, this is one of those moments which captures that exact moment where that last journey begins for a return that's never going to happen. And it also, it's the last story in this collection, and if I remember correctly, it is perhaps the last story he wrote in Kashmiri. After he moved to Delhi, he did write a few stories in Hindi, but I think this was the last story he wrote in Kashmiri. And it completely changes, the narrative style changes completely from those early stories, which are more realistic, they're funny, they're humorous. He talks about the difficulties of living and sharing a common landscape with people who share your language but have a different religion. He talks about the complications of those relationships, but he does it in a very witty, sort of humorous manner, never demonizing the other and never playing the victim card himself. But something changes after 89-90, and it's almost as if that straightforward language becomes impossible to describe the events that he and his family experienced. And he kind of resorts to imagery and more to imagery and allegory and symbolism and myth-making to describe what, perhaps to say that language is failing him, and he has to describe with these other modes of narration. And actually the story towards the end is a beautiful conversation where the narrator and his grandmother are having an argument with the sun representing, the burning plains of northern India in the summer, which Kashmiris were not accustomed to. And the sun brings in, if you can imagine, the sun brings in references to the mystical poet Lal Ded from the 14th century. He brings in references to Tulsidas, again another poet from the mid-14th, 15th century. And he brings in references to Gandhi. And when I was reflecting on this, I think what the narrator and the author are saying, these are all points of reference for a syncretic, harmonious culture. They all talk about Muslims and Hindus living in harmony. And the sun basically says, sort of thumbing his nose at all these people and saying, here's your harmonious community. See what happens when things don't work. And the sun at the end says, I smolder, but I don't turn to ash. People burn, yet they rage. They endure. They become used to fire and the blazing sun. You rage because you were used to snow and shade. Who knows if Deb understood all this? But I realized that there are only 2 paths in front of us, to endure or to rage. Death will last only a few more moments, but I have to live a long life. I have nothing to gain from rage. I must endure and adapt. Perhaps I have already begun to do so. It's a very, very powerful story, and I hope I've sort of communicated why it's one of my favorite stories.
It's true, it is very different from the others. There's also a movement away from the domestic, like There's all these beautiful domestic details of life in the earlier stories. You talked earlier about how you listened to your father's recordings of these stories, and what was that like? Like, as you were listening to the Kashmiri, were you hearing it in English already, or what role did the recordings play?
My spoken Kashmiri has always been pretty fluent because it was the only language, obviously it was my mother tongue, it was the first language I learned. It was the language that your mother speaks to you in, therefore it's your mother tongue, right? But I lost it when my parents moved to England. But coming back, because of my constant visits to Kashmir, and it was the only language that I could communicate with my grandmother, with my grandmother. And my grandmother, the author's mother, was she was not an educated woman, but she was a great repository of Kashmiri folk tales and songs and poetry from the mystic poets. And even as a young child, I remember sitting next to her and listening to those stories. And so going back to Kashmir those summers, I reignited that relationship with her and with the stories. So when I started listening to these stories, and there are a lot of references not immediately discernible to people who are not familiar with some of those tales. There are a lot of references to Kashmir's oral tradition and Kashmir's poetic tradition. And so some of those memories came back. But what I realized when I was listening to the stories was being a dramatist and a playwright, he carried over that orality to his fiction as well, which made the stories eminently suitable for an audible book, I think. But they did, in the hearing, there was an easier ability to listen to the rhythms and the cadences and how the language shifted and the rhymes. And I think one didn't capture that, even if I could have read the script. My collaborators did read the script, and they acknowledged that they hadn't quite captured those shifts until they heard the stories too. So interestingly, even though they could read the script, they too ended up listening to these stories incessantly. And it really brought back a language that I thought had died for me. But it was also, and then it was reinforced. I mean, the first time I stepped foot in Kashmir after 48 years last summer, I just stood outside the house and just listened to the sounds around me for about 10 minutes. And I realized, and I'm not particularly religious or particularly nationalistic, but I realized there must be something in your DNA that connects you to the people, to the land that your ancestors are from. There has to be something, because that feeling of being in a place and listening to sounds that were familiar was, again, very, very emotional. So I think, again, it made up for not being able to read, particularly because the co-translators also relied so much on the audio versions of these stories that we had recorded by various people that it made me very comfortable translating just from that.
Were there any things that were, untranslatable? Every language has things that are very hard to transfer to another language. Did you encounter phrases, words, expressions?
Yes, it's that famous expression, right? Lost in translation, found in translation. What do you gain? What have you lost? Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, and the story that I read from is a great example of that. Titles and poetry are notoriously hard to translate because so much is encapsulated in a title in 1 or 2 words. And to capture that in a language that has a completely different sentence structure and form and base. I mean, you can go from English to Spanish, Spanish to French with, I think, a little bit more ease than you can from Kashmiri to English. So the title of that story, which in the end was a bit of a cop-out for us, we called it To Rage or To Endure because that's the last line of the story. The original title in Kashmiri is just a single word called H-A-E-L, which is hurl. Hurl is roughly translated means getting accustomed to something, forming a habit, but never in the sense of something that you're very passionate and feel wonderful about. It's about getting accustomed to something because you have to, like doing your homework or brushing your teeth, or getting accustomed to something because there's no other way out. And it really, for me, this story captures that word best by defining it as it's at the intersection of acceptance and resignation. If you can think of those 2 points meeting at one point, that's what hurl is and that's what the story is. But absolutely impossible to translate into English. Certainly not even in a couple of words. The other part that was, this was one of the hardest stories to translate, actually, because it goes into algebra and all kinds of symbolism that we had to struggle with. But that part that I read about where the grandmother is looking around and trying to capture these images that she bundles into her heart, it was another area that in Kashmiri there's no concept of bundling into your heart. What the Kashmiri said and how it dealt with that image was she with her I always have to struggle to remember this. With her eyelashes, she lifted all these images and put them into her eyes so that she would carry the visual imagery of this. There is no concept of, like we would say here, bundling it into your heart. She bundled it into her eyes. But she did, there's a physical act of looking around and lifting those images, those objects with your eyelashes. As anyone can imagine, that was pretty hard to duplicate. So, that's just 2 examples from one story. And I can think of, the titles in particular where The Tongue and the Egg is one of the early stories, which is really a very contemporary story, even though it was written in the late 70s. It's about dissent and stifling of dissent and about censorship. Both in the political sphere and in the literary sphere, and certainly completely meaningful to us today as books are being banned. And it has a very problematic title in the original, which is even impossible to translate for me. It's that the story is about the tongue, but the question is about the egg. That's the title of the story, trying to weave those 2 concepts together. And that both editors kind of struck that out and said, no, we got to find something simpler. So we went with The Tongue and the Egg.
It speaks to your ability as a story writer to find ways around these obstacles. So even if you give a story a completely new title, but it's true to the story in English. And oftentimes the last sentence of the story is
the title. That's sometimes that's what you resort to, right? Because that's the last sentence that stays with you, and that's the title of the story. And other titles were difficult, and there was another passage in one of the earlier stories where the character is speaking in, I guess the nearest equivalent we would say is like pidgin English. They're speaking in. They're from a tribal area of Kashmir, and they have to capture that dialect, which is also, she's speaking, mixing that tribal dialect with Kashmiri, and that's where we all threw our hands up and said, this is not going to work. This is not going to happen. So unfortunately, what was one of the most humorous and beautiful passages in that story, we did translate it, but we kind of sanitized it for the language.
It sounds like a wonderful communal project. You're working both with your father's recordings of your uncle's stories and your other translators. are there any memorable moments from that whole experience? Were there any disagreements, famous disagreements, or?
Everyone asked that question again, back to the translation by consensus that someone called it. I don't think during the process of the translation, and I don't know if it was because of the pandemic, and because this was our little community for those 2 years, there was a fairly intense bonding. And it really worked very, very well. There were really no major disagreements. If there were disagreements about what's the English word, and I think because I probably had the most experience with English, and I was older, and I was the author's niece, so there was an element of giving in to me, if you like. But those were minors. I think where the interesting discussions came about, and gives you a little bit of a peep into the recent history of Kashmir. These, by 3 co-translators, all came of age after 1990. And so they had not lived in a community where the others, the Hindus, had lived. So explaining some of those particularly Hindu rituals or Hindu references in the stories, which are there all over, was very interesting, and it kind of brought home the fact that in a land where the 2 communities had lived together, now a generation was growing up that had not seen that kind of, again, don't want to call it harmonious, but that kind of coexistence where accommodations are made on both sides, but which leads to a broadening of experiences because you have another community to deal with, to go to school with, to go to work with, to socialize with. And that came home to me in spades during this process.
I wonder, when I studied translation in graduate school, we kept coming back to this question of who's your primary allegiance? Where should your primary allegiance be as the translator? To the author, to the reader, to the writer? And did you have to confront that question as you were working?
It's my first translation, and so it wasn't a question that had occurred to me before I started working on this. And I hadn't thought of the translator's role. I knew we weren't transcribing, I knew we were translating, and I knew it was important to arrive at a product, if you like, that was accessible to the English ear, because that's the target language, as they say. But through the process, I realized that there is an element of creativity in translation as well. That unless you actually translate it, you don't realize. Because a lot of translation at the end of the day is really about making decisions. Should you use this word or should you use that word? Should this come before? Should you follow a sentence structure that might not make total sense in English, or should you sort of invert it, even though that's not how the author did it, so that it makes sense? So ultimately it comes down to making decisions and pausing and seeing how to turn the story so that it stays as true as possible to the author, whose work you really, that's really your primary allegiance, I think. But it gets watered down by the desire to make it accessible in a very different language, and you end up inserting yourself a little bit more than I thought would happen. But I think the primary allegiance should be to the work and to the author.
Are you going to translate more of his work?
I'd like to, yes. I think this has been received very well, and like I said, this is 18 of 45 stories. There's a novella, there's plays that we're trying to lay our hands on. The problem has been these books were out of print. The original books were out of print, and we found them only in the library of Srinagar Kashmir University, and they were not in very good shape. Over the years, they had been they had deteriorated. So the first thing that we're doing right now is preserving those original texts and getting them reprinted. And once that's done, I think we will, certainly not all four of us, but probably one or two of us will go back to translating some more. That's certainly something I would like to do.
I think we have some time for questions from the audience.
Exactly. I'll take the mic and bring it around. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you very much for that. And as a Kashmiri who's lived in Kashmir 6 years less than you have, this was the only way it would be accessible for me too. First up, a question on Hare Krishna himself. Was he inspired by, did he come at the tail end of the progressive writers movement? Did he have any connection to that? I see the Dina Nadeem quote up front. If you could talk a little bit about his relation to that, because he then also seems to make quite a departure. I see he's trying different modes. There's some Kafka-esque elements that are coming in that would have heavily been from the progressive writers. If you could say something about that.
That's definitely true. I mean, he started writing in the late 60s. The short story format is relatively new to Kashmir. There's a lot of poetry and oral works and folk theatre. The first short story in Kashmiri was actually written, I believe, by Dinanath Nadim. I could be wrong, but I think that's true, in 1948. So it's that late. So when he was writing, there's only about 20, when Call was writing, there's only about 20 years of short story writing before him. And for anyone to be writing in that period, I think for most parts of India, you had to be a part of the progressive writers movement. They were all sort of brought up in that with Dinanath Nadim as their mentor through the most part. I'm not quite sure at what time the separation came in, but I think in my view, I would tend to agree with you that he started reading the European modernists. He read a lot of Kafka and Brecht and Ionesco and also Joyce and Virginia Woolf. And so he started incorporating those techniques into his works. And I'm not sure if that naturally represented a rupture from the progressive movement or because of Kashmir's particular political situation. There were other forces at work. But I think what that made his work become, I mean, a lot of people have referred to these as Kashmiri stories, and they are because they're based in Kashmir, they're rooted in Kashmir, but they're really modern stories, universal stories of exile, of alienation, of estrangement, of complicated relationships, of journeys back and forth. And I think that influence comes from his reading of the modernists. And of course, Ionesco and Brecht are very, very prominent in the plays that he wrote, which I haven't been able to get hold of yet, but will someday.
I hope you do so.
Thank you.
Sorry, I thought I saw a hand. That is not pressure. Any other questions? Going to the back.
So thank you so much for everything you've shared today. I was wondering, you talked a little bit in the beginning that you were working a lot with this translation during the media and social media blackout that happened in Kashmir. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that impacted your translation and your perception of the stories, and if you feel like it brought something that you wouldn't have otherwise had while working on this book.
I think social media or the internet, whatever you want to call it, works in two different ways. When it was blocked during the fall and winter of 2019, 2020, I found myself very isolated. And other than my father, there was really no one to talk to about these stories. And so I had the recording, so I started working by myself and would call my mentor in Bangalore from time to time. And got some very, very practical hints, like, you know, when you're translating, I do most of my work in longhand first. You leave two lines behind after each line, because you're going to come back and scratch that out, and you're going to put in another word, you're going to substitute something else. So it was a very lonely period. There was communication by telephone, but we couldn't get onto Zoom or any other platform to have long conversations. So I think what that did is it sort of, certainly in the publishers' minds, the HarperCollins publisher had already sort of told us that he was willing to publish these stories if we could get them translated. But I think in their minds, in his mind, it kind of became a project that would not ever get done because of all these considerations. And in some very perverse sort of way that made me even more determined to see it through. So I think it was, I don't know if it's because of the lockdown, the stopping of the internet, but something that I had sort of toyed and played with in my head for about 10 years became an impulse. It became more than an impulse. It became necessary to get that done. So whatever it took, it had to get done. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I'm coming up.
Thank you so much. This has been great and very touching. I'm from Russia originally, and it's fascinating to hear just all the parallels. Like you said, very universal. I'm curious, as a writer and also a translator, when you're going through the publication process or you're trying to present this collection, one of the big questions I feel that is asked is, why this work, why now? And it feels like you came to it as, I totally understand, a passion, family project. Did you have to answer that question and explain, why does this collection have to be available for English-speaking readers at this point in time? Or was it just, given his legacy, kind of a given that this should be available?
That's a very interesting question, which is a way of saying I don't know how to answer that.
Sorry.
I don't know. I think both things. I mean, because he had died in 2009, and it was clear to me, and really sort of underscored by the other translators who had read an enormous amount of Kashmiri literature when they came to this project, but had not read Call till I introduced them to him. Their response, their immediate reactions to, gosh, these stories are so wonderful, so prompted that desire to get his legacy out there and to showcase his work. But I think also there is a particular moment in time in history. Kashmir has been in the headlines for a lot of reasons, and none of them good. And I think it was important to sort of showcase a Kashmir that's just normal, at least in the writer's early stories, is just normal. It's people going about their daily lives. It only becomes a little abnormal or because it's Kashmir, where I think I write in my introduction, the ordinary always becomes extraordinary. And so, but it was an attempt to show that there, behind those headlines, there are human beings who have the same aspirations, the same hopes, the same desires, and you know, they're leading their lives in a certain way, and it's important for people in the English-speaking world to get behind those headlines and to see this as a country, a community, a place, a people that that needs to find their place in the world, a language that needs to find its place in the world, and that's being sort of more and more marginalized because the stories coming out of Kashmir are, just like the stories coming out of Palestine, are just, you know, stories of terror, of violence, of I don't know. You've all seen those stories, and
often suppressed.
And often suppressed, yes. I mean, we haven't even touched on that. There's if the Kashmiri Hindus lost their homeland, I always like to describe the Kashmiri Muslims' lives as being interrupted constantly because of government intervention, suppressions, military actions. So neither community has found peace, if you like, or the kind of peace they would like. So I think it was important to kind of put this across. And literature can do that in a way that journalism cannot. And so that's why this became even more important.
Thank you. One detail that's been haunting me from early in our conversation is that your uncle left his manuscripts behind. Why do you think he did that? Makes me think that he thought he was going to come back.
You would think so. It's by reconstructing the past. I was talking to his son, my cousin, because at the time we started working on this, or even before that, when people had approached him about working on the writer, doing their PhD dissertations, or doing some critical work, they could not find any manuscripts in the house that they lived in. And they searched high and low. They even turned over his computer to experts to see what they could find on the hard disks. There was nothing. And so that led us to believe, because there was no other alternative, that they were left behind in the ancestral home. And he does, it referred to it, I think, in the foreword to the last collections of stories. He tells you a lot of details in the forewords to his stories, which I think is important. We should translate those because it really puts a lot of color on all of this. He refers to his stories as these offsprings of my mind that I had to leave behind. And so that constructing all of that, and we know the house was looted, we know all the possessions were taken. I doubt those manuscripts were of value to anyone. They were probably sold as rags or scrap or burnt. So yes, they were lost. How they were lost, we don't know.
So this is really an act of preservation.
Yes.
You were working from texts, from the published texts that were also not in great condition.
They were not in great condition, but one of the things that has happened as word has gotten out, people of his generation, his peers, or people he communicated with, have started turning over letters and notes that they have from him, which has also been very fascinating and interesting to read. So we're starting slowly to create an archive, which I hope will happen.
The labor of love.
It's a labor of love, but it's also a template, I think, particularly in India. We need to learn the art of preservation better.
Yes.
And so hopefully it'll become a template for
everywhere,
other writers.
Everywhere. We live in this disposable era.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for...
Thank you. Thank you.
That was stunning. Thank you both. I obviously read a lot of literature of exile and displacement and migration, and this collection is very special. I'm very honored to have you. And to have you all with us tonight. We're going to do a signing, so you're welcome to pick up a copy of the book and come up. And thank you all again for joining us.